Welcome to toy-polloi.
Hello and welcome to another video from toy-polloi. Now in today's Fix It guide we're going to look at restoring a vintage 1970s Cyborg Cybo-interceptor. Now here in front of me you can see I have the remains of a Cybo-interceptor. This is a toy line that was produced by the company Dennis Fisher here in the UK, and it's based on the Japanese Henshin Cyborgs and Shonen Cyborgs. As you can see here, this is the Cyborg that should fit inside it. Now I've previously reviewed this vehicle and it should look like this. It should have a couple of wings, some wheels at the back and some missile launchers on the sides. And recently I picked up a job lot of Cyborg pieces to try and finish some parts of my collection, and in that lot was this, which is the Cybo-interceptor in a sort of sorry state. One of the wings has snapped off, as you can see here. This had previously been repaired. You can see there's actually a screw and some glue so at some point someone has tried to repair that, but that has snapped off again, and it needs a lot of well, it needs some sort of fixing. I can't quite work out what at the moment, but we'll remove what's there and see if we can fix that. It's also missing the rear wheels. If I bring in a complete one, you can see there are a set of two wheels on the back that should look like that, and this one has sadly again those have gone, long gone, and you can see it's also cracked, but that isn't unusual. The plastic that these toys are made of is very brittle, so I'm not actually going to worry about that, but we should be able to replace the wheels somehow. And then it also came with one missile, but again this missile has the end snapped off it. If I get an original missile here, you can see that's what it should look like. So we're going to restore that as well so we can get the missile launcher working. So let's get started and see what we can fix first. I think the first area to fix is probably this wing, because it looks like it's going to be the easiest thing to do. Now at some point someone has broken this. There should be a little tab that goes into a slot on the body, so let's just take off the other wing so we can compare and see what it should look like. So you can see here there should be a little sort of peg that goes inside part of the wing and holds it in place, and that has snapped off. Luckily we do still have that because it's snapped off and is inside here, and that's what someone has sort of tried to screw back in place. So I think the first thing to do is we need to get that piece out so we can see what it looks like. I'm hoping it should just be able to push that out like so, and there we have the little tab. So what we need to do is reattach that to this wing section. Now you can see they've actually put a screw through it, which probably isn't a bad way of fixing it, but the screw is not long enough and is also a little bit on the thin side. So let's see if we can remove this original fix, and then I'll look at putting maybe a bigger screw in and cleaning out some of this glue and sort of mess that's in there. First thing though, let's try and get that screw out. So maybe if I just use a pair of pliers and unscrew it, I think that's possibly the way we're going to have to go. Just try and get this out. I think it is coming. It's going to be a slow job though, so let me get this screw out and then we can try and break off some of this old glue and see what we can do to fix it. I think I've actually managed to do it now. Just a careful sort of bit of unwinding and we can see there's the original screw. It's just not long enough, and it actually looks like there's only thread about 2/3 of the way up the screw itself, so not enough to sort of hold that little piece in place. And they've also added some glue in there. You can see there's a bit of the remains of glue, so I need to try and remove that if possible. A lot of this old glue is quite brittle, so I'm hoping it should just sort of break off. Maybe with this or a knife or screwdriver I should be able to just sort of crack out that old glue. I think a screwdriver might be better to get rid of that, just to clean this up so we can start from afresh. Now that I've managed to get all of the glue out, I can actually see what's going on. And I think the way they tried to fix this is actually probably a pretty good way of doing it. What they really needed though was a longer screw. So I've just been in my sort of spares pot and found this one. This is a sort of standard size Micronauts and Microman screw. This actually came out of a busted Baron Karza that I've got. So it's slightly longer than the one that they had originally. It's also got a bit of a fatter screw. So if I just hold that up, we can sort of see that it's going to stick out by about 5mm, and that's really about the length that we need to go into this little tab so that it does actually fit back on the wing. So my plan is to screw that one through the existing hole that they've already put in it, but I think this little tab here is going to need a slight bit of modification. I'm going to actually drill a hole into it so there's a little bit of more space in there. So because what you don't want to do is when you want to put the screw in, you don't want to actually split this bit of plastic, and the plastic that these toys are made of is really quite brittle. So I'm going to drill a hole into this. This looks like about a sort of 2.5mm diameter screw. So if I do a hole into this, which is about sort of 1.5mm in diameter, then there should be still enough space for everything to fit. So I'm going to drill a hole into this first, and then we can screw this back together. And I may even add a little bit of glue around it, but I'm hoping that should be strong enough to hold this wing in place. So first up, I'm just going to drill this hole into the little tab here. So just to make it a little bit sort of wider. The next stage of this is actually going to be fairly tricky because you've got to screw something where you can't actually get the screw driver at a sort of reasonable level. So I'm going to just try and push this in and see how much I can bend the plastic to get the screw started. So I just put that in place. Just start screwing it through. Actually, that's not going too bad, so we can now try and put this end on. I want to actually line this up so that the brake is sort of lined up to how it was broken originally, which is sort of like that. And then hopefully I can hold this all in place and screw in the rest of this screw. That feels pretty sturdy actually, so we can slot this back in place onto the Cybo-interceptor and see how that works. Yeah, that's not too bad actually. It seems to sort of work reasonably well. Certainly moves. Now there is another problem on this Cybo-interceptor, which is something that I'd always noticed, the fact that it's not been built particularly well. So there's little bits of sort of plastic sticking out, and I reckon if we trim those off, the wing will actually work a bit better. So I'm just going to get a pair of plastic nippers, and I reckon if I just trim off that little tab there, then this wing will actually fit a lot snugger and work a lot better. Yeah, that seems to work quite nicely. So there we go, that's the wing reattached. We can now move on to sorting out the wheels. Now the next issue after the wings is the rear wheels, because these are completely missing on this Cybo-interceptor, and really I don't think there's any way I'm going to find another set of these original wheels, because really it's quite a rare toy, so finding a spare one is probably sort of nigh on impossible. So I think what we've got to do is actually recreate some wheels. So if I bring in my unbroken Cybo-interceptor, you can see it's a fairly simple construction, the wheels on the back. There are two wheels held on with a axle that goes across the middle. Now these have little metal sort of studs on either side, and they look sort of fairly sort of simple basic wheels, and should be something that could easily be found. Now with a bit of research and a bit of searching, I found you can buy some aeroplane wheels for a model aeroplane. Now I picked these up off eBay. These actually came all the way from China because I couldn't find any in the UK that were the same size, but you can see these are very similar sort of in style. They're plastic rather than metal, but I think if we just sort of paint that bit it would look fairly similar. But if I hold these up to the original ones, you can see that's not a bad match. They're slightly smaller, but I don't really think that matters when we're replacing both of them together. We just want to get something that looks as good as it can. So you can see it's roughly the same sort of thickness and roughly the same diameter. So I'm going to use these to recreate this sort of wheel section on the back of the Turbo-interceptor. Now I've already done a bit of preparation for this because a lot of this stuff is fairly basic, but it just sort of takes some time. So I took one of the wheels and I then sort of held it up and measured the distance between the two wheels on the original one, which turns out to be from sort of outer edge to outer edge is about 7 centimeters. And in my toolbox outside I have some bits of metal rod. Now these are the sort of rods that you would use actually to replace axles on sort of die-cast and dinky toys. Now this is a 2mm piece of rod, which looks like it should be about the same sort of thickness as the original, and I've cut that to be 7 centimeters long, so that's will match on this other one here. Now the holes inside these aeroplane wheels is actually a little bit too small for this, so I've carefully drilled out, if I just get them in from the side here, the holes of another 2 of the wheels, so that these are now, these have a 2mm hole in the middle which matches the axle that I have here. So we can just push one of these onto the end. Should push on fairly tightly, which it does, and you can see we've got the basis of a new axle to go on this toy. Now again, on the original Cybo-interceptor there's a few little bits of plastic that sort of hold the wheels sort of out, because otherwise they would rattle about. And again, searching in my toy box and tools box, I have found this bit of plastic which you've seen me use multiple times. Now this came in a pair of shoes that Mrs. Toy-Polloi bought from a place called Hotter, so if you ever want to buy shoes from Hotter, this is what comes inside it. They use it as a shoehorn, and every time you buy a pair of shoes you'll get 2 bits of this plastic the length of the shoes, and it's incredibly useful, and I keep it every time she buys some. It's a sort of hollow little tube, and you can cut this in just using plastic nippers or a knife, and I've cut a couple of little lengths which roughly match the sort of size of the original ones, and we're going to use these as the spacers on my new axle. So I've got 2 of those. I have my new axle. I can just slot one on like so. We can put that through the hole that's left on the bottom of the Cybo-interceptor, put another of the spacers in, and then drop the other wheel in place. And you can see we've got something that looks roughly like the original. Now these bits of plastic are slightly thicker, but I'm actually think that's a better way to have it, because the problem with these thinner bits of plastic is quite often when you see these Cybo-interceptors, people have pushed down on the toy and the axles bend, so this thicker bit of plastic stops you being able to push down on the wheels because they're now held in place more firmly. And if we turn this over, you can see they nicely roll. So all I've got to do now is actually sort of paint them and make them look a little bit more like the original one. So the bits of plastic tubing I'm going to paint black, and then the insides of the wheels I think I'll also paint black, because that should be a little sort of metal disc there, but it's really quite dull, so maybe black or just slightly off grey, and I think it won't look too bad. So let's get those bits painted and we can finish these wheels off. But as you can see, that's a fairly simple bit of construction, and we've really saved this toy. For painting these bits I would normally use some Humbrol acrylics or maybe even a bit of spray paint, but as I've been using these Edding paint pens quite a lot on some recent projects and I haven't had, I thought I'd use these. It's not really that vital that these are painted amazingly well, because for a start these little bits are hidden underneath, and the wheels really, you just want them to be a sort of dark black, so I think this should work quite nicely, and they're incredibly easy to use and save sort of making the mess of getting anything else out. But you can see I should be able to just sort of paint this surface. I'm going to do it in a few little bits so that I don't get paint all over my fingers, but it's going to cover quite well. And the same we can do on the wheel, so you can see that does cover quite nicely, and it dries pretty quickly as well, which is always important when you're painting. So I'm just going to do that in little stages. Let's have a go at doing one of these wheels. Now that all the pieces have had time to dry, we can start fitting these back on the toy. So I'll just bring in the broken Cybo-interceptor again, and we can take the wheel with the axle attached, and I'm going to drop on one of these little spacers which we've now painted black. We can push that through the hole. We'll take on one of the other spacers and push that back on, and then we can slot on the other wheel. I think just the simple fact of painting those black certainly makes them look a bit better. They don't stand out as much. There's a little bit gloss actually. I always forget how gloss the Edding pens are, but that will sort of wear off with time. if we compare it to the original one, you can see that's actually now quite a good match. And if we look at these two side by side, so you can see the sort of old and new wheels. They're not sort of the perfect match, but they're certainly good enough, and it makes this toy playable with again, or at least displayable with, which is really all I was after, because this is such a sort of odd little rare toy. I just wanted one on display because this one actually has a box, so I'm going to keep that one boxed. But as you can see, that's not a bad result there. So very simple way of replacing the wheels on this. And those wheels, I ended up buying 6 of them just because I couldn't buy 2 on their own. And even including the postage from China, they only cost £3.50. So an absolute bargain. Right, the last thing we need to do is to fix the broken missile that came with this Cybo-interceptor. Now the toy would have originally come with quite a few of these missiles, and this is how they should look. You can see this little tab on the end, and this is what catches inside the launching mechanism on the wing. So if I just drop that one in place, you can hear it click and the little lever goes go up, and if I press that, it will fire out, and that bit holds it in place. Now the one that came with this toy is missing the end. It's clearly just snapped off. If I just show you those two, and so when you push the missile into the launcher, there's nothing for it to latch onto, so we need to replace this end little part so that the missile works again. Now I'm going to go to my standard fix for this, which is Lego. I have a little pot of very useful Lego pieces, as you can see here, and inside this pot is this Lego antenna, and I think this is what we're going to use to recreate that little tab. Now you can see that the diameter of the tab is about sort of 3mm, and the diameter of this sort of thick part of this aerial is only about 2mm. But the great thing with Lego is all the parts are sort of interchangeable. So I've got another sort of 2mm bit here which matches that bit on the antenna, and you can see if I bring in this other piece that this one will slot inside that one. So what I've done is I've cut off the end of this little sort of hoop part here. This is a Lego hanger. There are other pieces of Lego that use this. It just happens to be that I've got quite a few of these in my toolbox, and I've stuck that onto the end of the antenna. So you can see here I've now sort of made that little bit slightly thicker, and that is what we're going to use to replace the broken little end here. So you can see that now matches perfectly. I've just glued that on with a bit of super glue. So what we're going to do on this one is I'm actually going to cut off the sort of thin part of this, because we can't actually make use of that. It's not going to be strong enough to attach anything to. So I've just got a pair of plastic nippers here, and I'm going to carefully cut that off, so we just ended up with the thick part. I can now drill a hole in that the same diameter as the little bit of plastic here from the antenna, which I believe is 1.5mm, but I'll just double check that. I'm going to drill in a hole, and I'm going to drill it in quite a long way so that I can insert a large length of the antenna in there, and we can match it up and see if that works. And if that does work, we then give this a quick coat of paint just to sort of hide the fact that it is a bit of Lego, and hopefully that missile will work. So I'm going to get a hole drilled in there first, and we can start seeing if we can get that glued in place. So here we go. This is actually a 2mm drill bit, because the sort of longer part of the antenna is 2mm, but that still should be plenty of room for me to drill a hole in this and have a bit of space around the edge. So I'm just going to very carefully use my drill to drill this hole. So here's the hole drilled, and I've actually drilled in about that far because we really want quite a firm sort of connection here, because this has to hold all of the pressure of the spring to keep the missile in place. So what we can do now is I'm going to trim off a large chunk of the antenna, and then we can sort of slot this in and see how much we need to remove to make it the same length as the original one. So you can see that's still quite a long piece. So I'll just take that off, and I can trim off another chunk, because we want this to match the same sort of dimensions and length of the original pretty well. You can see that's a pretty good match. So let's see if that actually works before I glue it in place. So here's the missile. I'm going to lock that in, and you can see it does work, so I should be able to fire that now. Yeah, and that's without any glue. So a little bit of super glue in there, and then we can paint that up. And I think that's a perfectly good fix for this missile. It now does work again. So let's put a bit of glue in there. I'm just going to use a little bit of super glue because I find that's the quickest way for doing these sort of fixes. So it's actually quite a tight fix already in that hole. So I don't think it's going to be too much of a problem. So I'm just going to put a little bit of, just a small amount of super glue on the end there. Make sure that goes in the hole. And then we can push that. Oops, it's already gone off. Let me push that in harder. There we go. And we'll just let that set, and then we'll sort out painting that. Now, I don't actually have any paints the right sort of pink colour, and because this is hidden inside the toy, I'm not really that fussed about how accurate it is. So I'm just going to again use an Edding paint pen. Now, this is supposedly a red paint pen, but it actually comes out quite a pink colour. So at least this end part of the missile will not look so sort of obvious with the black and yellow sort of parts that it has at the moment, which are clearly bits of Lego. So I think just a little coat of this just to sort of hide it. If I ever do get some pink paint in, I will obviously recolour this, but for now I think this will just sort of hide the fact that it's sort of quite obviously other bits of plastic. Sometimes while I'm sort of messing about waiting for things to dry, I do sort of see what I can make, and I've actually managed to make a colour that matches really well. So that Edding pen is sort of obsolete now. I mixed a bit of this RC406, which is quite a sort of pinky colour, almost the same colour as the Edding pen, with a bit of black and a bit of white. So that's 33 and 34, and I've come up with this colour, which, as you can see, is incredibly close. So I did say I don't have the right sort of paints in stock, but actually it turns out with a bit of careful mixing I do have the right paints in stock, and I can make something that really does match quite closely. So I'm just going to finish this off with a little bit of this humble acrylic stuff, and yeah, it's incredible that it matches so closely. I didn't really think that I had anything that really would match this colour, but as I showed, sometimes these things just sort of work out. So yeah, there you go. I do have the right colours just by mixing it. You can see that's certainly a much better match than the Edding paint pen, and I think I'm much happier with that. I'm glad I sort of spent the time to just have a little mix of colours. So here's the missile, all the paint has dried. You can see that's actually a pretty reasonable match, certainly a lot better than those Edding paint pens. Let's give this missile a try. So I'm just going to slot it into the missile socket. You can see that holds in place. So now if I press the button, it does fire. So that's really quite good, and it should be strong enough that it can stay in there for a good long time. The fact that I pushed the Lego piece sort of in quite far and glued it should give it quite a lot of strength. So I'm really pleased with how well that fix has worked, and at least it means that I can fire a missile out of this toy, even if I only just have the one. But at some point maybe I'll get lucky and I'll find another spare one. And here we have the finished Cybo-interceptor. Everything is looking pretty good on it. I'm very happy with how the wheels turned out. I think most people probably wouldn't even notice that those weren't the original wheels on the back there. Obviously the wing now works, and the missile fires as I've just shown you. Now, this isn't the most amazing of toys. If you want to see more about it, then do check out my review of the vintage Cyborg Cybo-interceptor, which I did a few months back, because it isn't an amazing toy, but it does have a certain charm about it, and these things aren't that easy to come across, and when you do, they are quite often broken, as I've shown you. So this one is going to go in my collection on display, and my very minty one is going back in its box to be sort of stored neatly away. But it's certainly a toy that I'm really glad that I've managed to fix, because they just don't come up very often at all. So I hope this restoration has been of interest to you, and thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching Toy-Polloi. Subscribe for more great videos.